Hello and welcome to The Thing About Golf, Golf Australia magazine's quest to answer that unanswerable question, just what is it that gets people so nutty about this silly game? My name's Rod Murray, and along with renowned Scottish golf writer John Huggan, it's my great privilege to bring you each fortnight a chat with somebody from the world of golf to get their perspective on what makes the game so addictive. We interview our fair share of players, though they're not the main target. We also peek into the world of the golf business, media, administration, and more. All areas of the game that are home to passionate and dedicated golfers. On this episode, I vacate the host seat for the second straight time, so that we can fulfill a promise made last month when Huggy first joined the show. Back then, we told you his first interview would be with one of the best sports writers in history, Tom Callahan. But his fellow Scot Robert McIntyre interrupted the schedule by winning his first European Tour title. If you haven't listened to that episode, we'll wait while you go and do that now. For everyone else, Huggy's chat with Tom Callahan follows, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy it as much as I did.
Tom Callahan, thanks for being my first guest on the Thing About Golf podcast. You've been writing about sports and the top sportsman now for the best part of half a century, but it seems like you've always been kind of drawn to golf. Is that safe to say or fair to say?
Yeah, because there are trees. You know, I like everything that's played during the day. You know, so you're not riding at 11:30 at night as fast as you can.
But there's got to be, what about the game itself? I mean,
I caddied as a kid. You know, I caddied like a demon. You know, I was in the summertime, every day I caddied. Mm-hmm. You know, and I caddied at a place in Baltimore called the Country Club of Maryland. And the caddies, excuse me, were allowed on the golf course before noon on Fridays. And so I went and bought 4 golf clubs, a 2-iron, a 9-iron, a driver, and a sand wedge. And with green stamps, I got a bag. And so I had a 4-club set, and I played every Friday. And I was no good, of course, but I was like big hitter, big misser. And so I kind of, you know, I like doing it, and it helped. I can't understand golf writers who don't play. You know, you're kind of required to play, so you have some kind of understanding of what's going on. You don't have to be good at it, you know. But through the years, I've played with lots of great players. You know, just you know, for the fact that I could keep going.
Is it true then that there's an old cliche about how you play even 9 holes of golf with somebody, you get insight into their character? Have you found that over the years?
Absolutely. You know, I think you learn about a guy on the golf course. You learn if he's honest with himself primarily. You know, but it's true. There's something about it, and you know, I mean, I've been in, you know, I played golf with Sam Snead. I played golf with Jack Nicklaus. I drew Nicklaus in a Pro-Am at the Ohio Kings Island Open. And it was supposedly a random draw. It was fixed, of course.
Yeah.
You know, I was the columnist at the local paper, and Nicklaus told me before we teed off, he said, they're trying to warm you up. Because I had written a column about the golf course. I said it was a pretty girl for a blind date. And he said the organizers are trying to warm you up, but don't tell them I told you, you know. Yeah. And of course, it's a terrible thing to have to play golf with Jack Nicklaus at the top of his game. He shot 62 later that week to win the tournament, but we finished like last in the Pro-Am. And his caddy, the fuzzy-wigged, gray-haired Angelo Argia, trying to think of something nice to say to me afterwards, said, "You only hit one guy." You know, I hit him hard. You know, I mean, that's the thing. As bad a player as I've always been, I've always been a big hitter, and so the other plonkers who were playing with us, they couldn't hurt anybody, but I could.
Yeah.
When I'm steering the ball, they're lining up in funnels as if I was Jack Nicklaus, and you're in the weird position of, instead of watching the greatest player in the world hit a golf ball, the greatest player in the world's watching you hit a golf ball. It's like the world's on upside down.
Yeah.
And oh God, it was a horrible day. But Nicholas and I kind of got to know each other then, and this was early on. This was in the early '70s, and so I always knew him, and which helped, And but I mean, through the years, I played with Ernie Els before he won a Masters before he even played in a Masters, or played in a U.S. Open, and I lost $300 to Snead to Greenbrier. He gave me 9 strokes for 100, 100, 100. I said, sure, Sam, as long as you know that I know you could beat me playing left-handed.
He could certainly beat you at putting. I've seen you putt, Tom.
Yeah, I know. Hey, don't mention that. And putting side saddle, as he did in those days, he shot 69 to win the 300. I put it on my expense account.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. Isn't that what Golf Digest is for?
Yeah, of course. And he was good. He was good to play with. At the very end, you might remember this little clip. We were in the clubhouse with our shoes off and sitting with our feet up in our stocking feet, and we're watching a award ceremony at Oakmont from 1953, which was the last of 4 U.S. Open championships for Hogan, and the last of 4 runner-up positions in the U.S. Open for Snead, who won every major but the U.S. Open.
Yeah.
And at one point, Snead reaches over and he touches the trophy, big trophy, in Hogan's arms and rubs it. And Hogan takes the trophy, I'm sure you've seen this, and he rubs the trophy up and down Snead's stomach. And I said to Sam, you know what he's doing with that trophy, don't you? And he said, what? I said, you want to touch it. It wants to touch you. And he started to cry.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. He kept score by Hogan. So did Byron Nelson. I interviewed Nelson once, and he was rattling through his great year of winning, what was it, 18 straight, and he every time he mentioned the tournament, he'd say, and Hogan was there.
Yeah,
Hogan was there. He kept score by Hogan. Snead kept score by Hogan, but Hogan didn't keep score by anybody, And of course, I didn't know Hogan, but I was in his company a couple of times. And one of them was my great friend Dave Kindred and I went around the world playing golf to write a book about it. And, we went to China and Russia and everywhere. And it was a big boondoggle. And we stopped off at Shady Oak in Fort Worth and to see Hogan. And the young pro there was nice enough to introduce us. He said, I'm not making any guarantees. I'm not saying he'll talk to you, because he was difficult. But Hogan was very nice to us. He stood up, but he didn't sit back down again. He was in the clubhouse. He was in the lounge there, having a drink and looking out at the 18th green. And we had been at Carnoustie, a couple of weeks before, and I played hideously bad at Carnoustie. I had a ton of 8s, and I think I had a 10, and but I made a couple of pars, and I hit a 8-footer for eagle at the 6th hole, his hole, Hogan's Alley.
Yeah,
and of course I missed it, and so Kindred says to Hogan, he says, Mr. Hogan, Tom almost made a 3 on the 6th hole at Carnoustie last week. And Hogan said, "I don't remember individual holes anymore." And I said, "That's all right, Mr. Hogan. They all remember you." And he laughed, you know.
Yeah.
He laughed. But yeah, I can't really say I knew him, but I was in his company a couple of times.
Well, you've got to finish off that story because I've heard you tell that one before.
Oh,
when you went out to play, tell us what happened there.
Yeah, we had played the front nine first. Now we went out to play the other nine. Now I'm coming up 18. And I hit a 3-iron like 10 feet or something. And I look at the window, and Hogan's standing in the window, you know, by his table. And he's wrapped his great hands together and he hoists them over his head and shakes them in my direction, which, of course, what he didn't know was I'd started that hole with a different ball. But I told Raymond Floyd once, I said, I never saw Hogan play, but he saw me play.
That's one of the great lines. It has to be.
Yeah, and Floyd loved that. He's made me tell that story a couple of times.
Yeah. Now, even in the 10 minutes or so that we've already been talking, you've rhymed off a catalogue of star names through the ages in golf. I ask this because Jack Nicklaus has been in the news lately with his endorsement of President Trump. That has disappointed a lot of people around the world, me included, I have to say. But you've met all these people and seen them up close. How many of them have disappointed you? Is the old cliche about you should never meet your heroes, how true is that?
I've been pretty lucky in that regard. But although I admit that I also was disappointed in Jack and surprised because, Jack was a beacon of integrity his whole golfing life. And to me, almost the best thing that ever happened in a Ryder Cup, was when Tony Jacklin had a 2.5 footer or something to tie everything. Back in the days when that mattered, when that was unusual. And to Sam Snead's disgust, he was the captain.
Yeah.
Jack picked up the coin and said, and the important thing is what he said. He said, "You couldn't miss it, Tony, but I'm not going to give you the chance."
Yeah.
And to me, that's sportsmanship. That's the right thing to do. And basically, Nicklaus, when it came time, he virtually every time did the right thing to do. So it makes me sad that he can't see what a liar and four-flusher Trump is. And everybody who's played golf with him catches him cheating on the golf course. He cheats in life. He cheats in everything. And for Nicklaus not to see that, I mean, I understand that golfers, especially of Jack's vintage, are Republicans. They're right wingers. But Trump, exception. Trump is such a disappointment as a human being that for Jack to ally himself with that is it's just so surprising.
Yeah.
But in most ways, I have to say, I've seen Jack in a lot of situations. I was in his office once with him. He was sitting in his shorts, and he had one shoe off because he just showed me his hammer toe. Only Jack Nicklaus would think his hammer toe was interesting.
Yeah.
But we were talking about Tiger Woods, and he said to me, he said, "I don't even expect you to believe this." He said, "But I've been rooting for someone to come along and break my records." This was early on in Tiger's, time.
Did you believe that?
I guess I did. And he said, because he went on to say, he said, I never put Bobby Jones's records up on my bedroom wall. He said, I didn't diminish Jones by coming along. And he says, and Tiger's not going to diminish me by coming along and breaking my records. He said, everybody said as soon as he won the Masters, 17 more to go, Tiger. He said, well, I never had that pressure. He says, what I would like to, I would like to tell him, son, it's your turn. It's a wonderful ride down this road you're about to take. Get the most out of it. He was so authentic. He made me believe it. In his heart of hearts, I bet he's just as glad that Tiger fell short of the 18 majors, but because he's a human being.
Yeah.
But he everything he said made me respect him even more. And of course, Tiger was up against greater athletes, Ernie Els, but Nicklaus was up against geniuses. There's nobody playing now like Lee Trevino. There's nobody playing like Lee Trevino. No. And the guys he beat and the guys he jousted with, and Tom Watson, Tiger was beating bigger guys who hit it farther on bigger golf courses. But you know what? He wasn't up against that genius factor that Nicklaus was up against. And all those guys had their moments against Nicklaus, but he had more moments against them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I always think it's slightly unfair to compare anybody with Nicklaus or Woods. I mean, you mentioned Ernie. I mean, Ernie, especially had he been an American, would have been, hailed as this star of the ages, if you like. Same with, and Phil Mickelson, the same. I go back and forth between those two as to who was the number 2 player in the Tiger Woods era, if you like. But, I mean, you're right about Nicklaus. I mean, nobody... You mentioned some great names there, but they all kind of pale into insignificance against Jack's record. I mean, if you actually look at Jack's record, especially in our Open over here, I mean, it's ridiculous, his record. I mean, he was once outside the top 6 in 20 years or whatever it was, in the 60s and 70s. It's a ridiculous record.
You might not remember this, John, but when Rory McIlroy, I think he was 20, he had either just won in Carolina or was just about to win in Carolina, his first PGA Tour event. And he was taking some pictures for Golf Digest on the adjacent course to where the Players Championship is played. There's a sawgrass course where it used to be played.
Yeah.
And he was over there, and it was kind of a rainy day, and you were over there, and the photographer Don Farrar was taking pictures. And so
I know where you're headed with this, but go on.
well, we got into a cart to get out of the rain, Rory and I happened to have a guide in my hand, and I opened it up to Nicklaus's many pages, and I rattled off his finishes in the Open Championships. And it's something like second, third, second, first, second, fourth, second, fifth, and there's a 12th in there.
Yeah.
And that was the outlier. Everything else is fifth, fourth, third, second, first, fourth. And I finished. I did it from 1960, I think about 18 of them up to 1980.
Yeah.
And Rory looked at me. He was a kid then. And he said, wow.
Yeah.
And I laughed, but he had no idea. Well, who does? People don't really remember or realize how good he was. I mean, in my heart, I think Tiger's better. Tiger was a better player. There are things on his resume, when he held all 4 majors at once, when he won 7 of 11 majors, when he won the Open by 15 shots and then a month later the British, by 8, those are things Jack didn't do. And just the sight of him, to me, I consider him the best player I ever saw. But as you say, it's hard to. There's a flaw in kind of judging eras. It's so different, And I saw Jack. In the old days, we could walk. You remember the riders could walk along with him, And I saw him close up, and the first time I ever saw him, I was stunned at how little he is.
Yeah.
A little tiny guy, and little tiny feet and little tiny hands, but huge legs and incredible power. His boyhood coach, Jack Grout, who's a very sweet guy from Oklahoma, lovely guy, and he swore to me that Jack was never as long as a pro as he was as a boy, as a kid. And he brought himself in because he got tired of being referred to as a gorilla. He wanted to be a finesse player. And Grout tried to talk him out of it. He said, "You got this big advantage. Don't throw it away." But Jack wanted to be a certain kind of player. And he wasn't the perfect player. He didn't, as Trevino said, God doesn't give you everything. And he wasn't really given a short game. In his dotage, Phil Rogers reappeared, his old boyhood opponent, and taught him, gave him a little course in sand wedges that helped him. And he ended up winning a couple of majors after everybody thought he had stopped. And then, of course, he won the distant major in '86. He won the Masters. And I was there for that. I've wasted my life. I've been to 30-some of everything, World Series and Super Bowls and everything, but and Masters and U.S. Opens, and I kept going to the Open Championship long after I stopped the others, so I could hang around with Dan Jenkins. I was his driver, his chauffeur, because he couldn't drive. He couldn't drive on the left side of the road, and I barely could. I was driving on the left side of the road about 86% of the time, and Jenkins and I, we palled around, and he.
Well, I always used to ask if you guys were out in the car when you were in Britain, because if you were out in the car, I certainly wasn't going to go out in the roads. That's for sure.
Well, I always think they're tremendously courteous drivers here, because every time I go through a roundabout, everybody waves at me.
Yeah, I think there's a reason for that. Yeah. But you talk about Nicklaus. I mean, I don't want to leave him just yet. I mean, one of probably the hardest things he had to do was supersede Arnold Palmer in the hearts and minds of America. I'm not sure he ever did that. What was it? Was the kind of stereotype true that Arnold was loved and Jack was admired?
I wrote this line, I'm going to say 40 years ago anyway. It was as if God said to Nicklaus, "You will have skills like no other." Then turned to Palmer and whispered, "But they will love you more." And I think that was the kind of bargain, the deal. Palmer beat Nicklaus. Nicklaus beat Palmer in the U.S. Open at Oakmont when Nicklaus was 22, and nobody wanted Palmer beaten.
Yeah.
And Nicklaus was in his Fat Jack phase, and people were screaming, "Nick, that fat guts," And Jack, of course, didn't hear him, because Jack was alone on the golf course in several ways, and of course Palmer wasn't in favor of heckling. He was a complete sportsman. And he was awed by Jack, but he said, I heard him say more than once, that if he could have beat Jack in the playoff in that original U.S. Open, in '62, if he could have held him off there, he might have held him off for a little while longer. But he said, I wasn't going to be able to hold him off forever, and which was very honest. I mean, Nicklaus was better, but Palmer was more saleable. Nicklaus had to get rid of Mark McCormick, the agent, because even though he had gone by Palmer, Mark was still finding it easier to sell Palmer than Jack. And the big three, you fold Gary Player into that, and the three of them traveled the world, and Arnold would be at the controls of the plane, and Player would be under the seat, scared to death, and the three of them, they would have ginger ale battles in their hotel rooms, and it was really kind of boyish stuff. In fact, Jack said to me once, he said, one time, Arnold, early on, we got to kicking each other under the table. He kicked me, I kicked him. We had huge bruises. He said we used to do the stupidest stuff, But that was the relationship. All three of them were kind of mutually jealous of each other. Player, least of all, because Player, he was kind of like the guy who waited for peace to come between the other two, And I know your Player isn't one of your favorites, but the funny thing is, he is kind of one of mine. I know some of his imperfections, but I understood, because he was a 140-pound guy competing with these two giants and holding his own, really, which I always admired. But I was in South Africa once, and I was staying at the Santon Sun Hotel, where everybody stays in Johannesburg, and I went and saw Player on a Saturday to interview him. Now I'm finished. I've done my deal, and the phone rings the next morning, like 5 o'clock in the morning. Tom, it's Gary. I was so.
Was that your South African accent, by the way? So.
No. I swallowed. And so I told. I forgot where I was. I didn't know I was in South Africa. I didn't know it was Gary Player calling. But he said, I'm sending a car for you. I don't like the idea of you being in a hotel on a Sunday. And so he sent his car and dragged me all the way back to Lanseria for brunch with his wife and his children. He's a real gentleman Player. And I have to admit, I've had a tremendous weakness for him through the years, though I know he's not perfect.
Speaking of South Africans, I know you don't like to play favourites in our business, but I know you've always had a soft spot for Arnie. Can you expand on why that is?
Well, the reason was, the very first time I met him, I interviewed him in his agent's office in Johannesburg, and as I say, he hadn't yet qualified for a Masters or a U.S. Open, but he played in a British, and he had a good result. He might have finished sixth or something in that first British he played in. And he was the next guy, you kind of knew. The players know first. And so Golf Digest wanted me to write a profile on him. But anyway, so when we finished our talk, I said, what are you going to do this afternoon? He said, I'm playing golf in Pretoria. And I said, do you mind if I come follow you? And he said, no. So, of course, I got lost. And by the time I got there, they were going down the first fairway, he and two other guys. And he says, where's your clubs? I said, they're in the car. He said, go get them, man. So I got my clubs. And we were playing with an Air Force buddy of his named Gary Todd, big guy, big as Ernie, and a big hitter, though, I don't know how many shots Ernie was giving him, but it wasn't enough. Ernie birdied the first 5 holes, and now we're on the 6th tee, and Ernie's just talking to me. He's hardly paying any attention to his golf ball, and he's birdied the first 5 holes. And now we get to the 6th tee, a par 3, and there's a little wait. And Todd is across the tee from us, and smoke is coming out of his ears. And he says, hey, Elsie, the bleeping guy knows you can play, And I looked at each other and laughed. And Ernie did take his foot off the accelerator. You learn about, as you said before, you learn about a guy on the golf course. Yeah. And Ernie backed off, started making pars. And that was the first thing I knew about him. The first thing I knew about him was he's a good guy, And so through the years, I always had a kind of a weak spot for him. I have to admit it. People laughed at me because I went on the Today Show selling a book the day after Ernie finished second at Wentworth to Jansen, I think. And now they're on their way to Oakmont. And the last question Brian Gumbel asked me on TV, he said, "Who's going to win the Open next week?" I said, "Ernie Els." He had never heard of him.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the next week when he did win at Oakmont, Brian Gumbel on the Today Show, Tom Callahan said that last week, which was, if students of my pick through the years would know, it's very unusual for me to get that right. But yeah, I always had a kind of a feeling for him, and he, to me, he's the victim, the main victim of Tiger. He was trying to combat Tiger when he was alone doing it. People forget Mickelson didn't engage for 10 years. He wasn't. It was Ernie who was finishing second that summer, 23 shots back.
Yeah.
Second in the U.S. Open, second in the British. Well, that would have been enough to kill Bruce Crampton behind Nicklaus. Tom Weiskopf climbed into the gutter and pulled the leaves over top of him rather than look Nicklaus in the eye. But Ernie kept on. He kept trying, and then almost by an act of God, he ended up winning another Open Championship. And I was thrilled that he won an Open Championship. And I had some quid on him. I bet on him. And
but then you always did.
I usually had both an emotional and a monetary stake in him, and he never let me down. And I think you'll understand this because you know him better than I do. He never lets you down. He never says he never does or says the wrong thing. He's incredibly authentic, and he's got he's taken a lot of beating because he was convinced when he showed up that he was going to have a turn as number one, and he really didn't. I mean, he did in a technical sense. I think he was ranked number one for 10 or 11 weeks or something, but he was never number one in what I call the Ted Williams sense, where people would see him walking down the street and say, "There goes the best golfer in the world." No one ever said that about Ernie, and he was sure he was going to have a turn, and so that was a big disappointment. But on the other hand, I never felt him rooting against Tiger. He was like he came off of an 18th green at Disney one year, and he played great and lost by a shot to Tiger, and he said to me, "Tom, he was out of this world good. He was out of this world good." There were guys who resented Ernie. Curtis Strange, for one. When Ernie would say, "He's from Mars," they would say, "Ernie Els a quitter." You don't say that about your opponent.
No.
And
you certainly wouldn't say that to Ernie's face. That's for sure.
Ernie beat just about the last guy. I would want to fight in professional golf. Just about the last guy. Maybe Wee Woozy would be on that list too. But whoever fights Ernie has to rely on his goodness, not to kill them.
Yeah. Where do you, before we get to Tiger, where do you stand on I touched on it earlier, the Ernie v. Phil debate on who was the second best player in that time?
I've changed my mind slightly. I thought Ernie was worlds better, but I considered Ernie the best world player, and I considered Phil the better PGA Tour player. And but when Phil won at Muirfield, he crossed the Rubicon to me. He became much bigger and better in my way of thinking. For one thing, he was wonderful that day, that back nine especially. But he had never really done much on links courses. In fact, his two links victories were 8 days apart that week.
Yeah.
And and he but to me, that moved him up, in my mind, by a lot. And I don't think we could pin him down. But if we put him on a lie detector machine, I think he would say Muirfield was his best win, was the one that mattered the most to him.
Yeah,
because it's the one that separated him from what he had been. He had been great. It's not like he was a Hall of Famer. There's no doubt about that. But he moved into a new place by winning at Muirfield and winning the way he did.
Well, I think that, I've talked to Phil enough at Scottish Opens over the years, one-on-one. He was always good enough to give me some time at Scottish Opens for a few years when he was playing. And I think he agrees with everything that you just said, 100%. Oh, I think he elevated himself in his own mind when he won the Open. He knew that was the glaring hole in his resume, if you like.
I'm glad to hear that. I've never talked to him about it. He's been very generous to me through the years. I once wanted to come see him to talk to him about Tiger, and he said, "Oh, don't come. If you come, I'll be stuck with you." He said, "Just call me. I won't hurry you. We can talk on the phone." And we had a very long conversation about Tiger on the phone. And but he was really a supporting player in the early years. Like, as no one remembers, the famous call at the Players, better than most, better than most, better than most. Tiger holds an impossible putt at the Players. Mickelson was on the green.
Yeah.
He was playing with him when that happened, but nobody remembered that he was there. He wasn't a lead character. He was the guy who delivered the flowers in the second act. He wasn't a best supporting actor, And in those days, when it was Ernie alone, and that was a lonely thing to be, because Tiger was so good. And people, I don't even think people really remember how good he was, because it's so long ago, 2000. Tiger, he at the beginning, 99, 2000, 2001, he was so much better. He really didn't have to play particularly well to win, but he did play particularly well a lot. And as David Faraday used to say, one by one, all my memories in golf were being replaced by his. Because he's following him everywhere, and all he's seeing is one great shot after another. And so Mickelson was never really a patch on him. And that's another thing. Tiger would never say it, but if we put him on a polygraph, I think he would say Ernie was his big opponent.
Yeah. Let's talk about Tiger now, because but maybe the exception of Jaime Diaz, you've been around or been closer to the inner circle, if you like. When you did the book, you went to Vietnam to find the real Tiger, if you like, and you knew his father very well. What do you make of Tiger as a human being before we even get into his golf?
Well, I agree with you, by the way. I think Jaime Diaz has had Tiger in the best perspective for the longest.
Yeah.
But in the course of going to Vietnam and looking for Tiger Phong, I got to know Earl certainly pretty well, and Tiger, about as well as you can. But
he's got to be a strange human being, Tom, to be certainly not multi-dimensional. Nobody who's the best in the world at anything is ever going to be a rounded human being. You can't be, because you spend so much time on one thing. But Tiger was so much better than everybody else. But he's an extraordinary human being in many ways. But what was your take on him?
Well, I said to Earl once, when you assembled that kid in your garage, you left out some human parts. And he laughed. Tiger is so self-absorbed that it could make you want to cry. And Hank Haney, his old swing coach, used to describe dinners where Tiger'd finish his dinner and get up and walk out in a restaurant. He wouldn't say to Hank, "Are you done? You almost done?" He'd finish and get up and walk out.
Yeah.
He was that self-centered, And when Golf Digest wanted me to go to Vietnam looking for Tiger Phong, well, the whole thing started when I was at the Milwaukee Open, Tiger's first pro, his debut.
Yeah.
Hello world, So Earl, that's the first conversation I ever had with Earl in a group of guys, and he said he named him. He changed Eldrick's name to Tiger the first day in the maternity ward. He said, I renamed him after my Vietnam comrade, Tiger Phong. He said, Colonel Phong, because I knew someday, I just knew Tiger was going to end up famous, and that my old friend would pick up a newspaper or magazine and see his name and say, that must be Woody's kid. And we'd find each other again. Well, I didn't believe this, And so I said to him, me being me, I said, when were you in Vietnam, Earl? And he said, I'm not sure. I said, you're not sure when you were in Vietnam? He said, in the 60s the first time, then in the 70s. I said, give me the name of anybody. This is a mean thing to say, by the way. I said, give me the name of anybody who died around you. I live in Washington. I'll go to the wall and I'll tell you exactly when you were there. And he said, no Americans died around me. I was a advisor. Only South Vietnamese died around me. And I wondered to myself, I wonder if this guy even was in the military, So when Golf Digest wanted me to go to Vietnam, I said, look, I'm not going until I'm sure he exists. I just don't, it's not going to be any fun to go all the way to find it's a fraud, So I did a Freedom of Information Act request on Earl's records. And they came back like the week before the 97 Masters. And, sure enough, he had been 13 months in Vietnam in the 60s and 13 months in the 70s. And so when I went to Augusta, I handed the records to Earl. He was sitting under an umbrella table outside the clubhouse. And he looked at me and he said, you didn't believe me, did you? I said, no. I said, who? And everything he said, typical, John, he said to me in Milwaukee, I said, do you think he'll make enough money in he's allowed to play in 7 events. Do you think he'll make enough money to avoid Q school? And he looked at me and he said, 7 events, he's going to win one of them, isn't he? I thought to myself, boy, are you sheltered. And he won 2 of them.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Earl and I kind of got along, we could talk. And he would say things to me like, Tiger never lies. He never lies. That he told a lie when he was a little boy once, and it made him physically sick. I said, Earl, the biggest liar on the PGA Tour. He would laugh. But I would say to Tiger, I'd go see Earl at Open Championships. I watched TV with him one day. Me and Bev Norwood. Remember Bev Norwood?
Yeah, of course.
He was an IMG guy. We would go sit with Earl as we watched Tiger on TV. And he'd talk to the television screen. He'd say, Tiger, you're standing too close to the ball. And the next day, Earl would wave me over and he'd say, Tiger called me last night. He said, I heard you, Pop. I was standing close to the ball. And I said, Earl, there are a million writers out here who will believe that.
Yeah.
He said, do you mind if I believe? I said, no, not your problem. Sure, go ahead. But But yeah, I mean, I got along with him. He had a lot more decency than his boy. You know, he was a human being. You know, he was really, you know, he was really a reprobate in a lot of ways. But I went into a cocktail party at Sherwood when Tiger was having that tournament he has in California, and Tiger was in the room and with his crowd, and Tita, his mother, was in the room with her crowd, and she and Earl were estranged but pretending not to be. And Earl was in the middle of the room wearing like a black sweater with a gold disc around his neck. He looked like a lounge lizard from Caesar's Palace. And this prostitute on his arm, you know, and not an attractive one either. And he looked at me. I wasn't even looking for him, but he caught my eye and he whispered, "My niece." But I mean, I said to Tiger once, "How come you're not staying with your dad, you know, at that house and at the Open?" He said, "Are you kidding?" He said, "You know, Mom and Pop are back under the same roof. Creeps me out, you know." But yeah, I mean, I got along with him. You know, we weren't friendly because, you know, but I don't think he was friendly with any of the writers. And I certainly wrote things that he didn't like, but we got along. I could every now and then when I sent him an email, he'd always answer.
Yeah. I have a theory, though, Tom, that, I mean, for all his, Earl gets all the publicity for his influence on Tiger, but I have a theory that there's a lot of his mother in him as well. I mean, she's tough in my very limited experience.
Well, Tiger told me all the punishments came from Tita.
Yeah.
He said, "My father never spanked me. My mother did." He said, my mother was always worried that I was embarrassing her. You know, that was the worst thing I could do, was embarrass her. You know, but she was, I think he loved them both, but even though he considered them both to be incredibly eccentric, you know, and he'd get away from them when he could. And, but she was a legend in junior golf because she followed him. You know, she was 10 steps behind him the whole trip. She was always there, and she, you know, I think you're right. I think she had a big influence on him, and Earl used to say she set the rules. Tiger and I obeyed him, you know, and you know, and she was like the Manchurian Candidate. You know, but you know, he loved them, and he I think he loved the first family as much as he could. He finally let them go, you know, because see, when Earl came home from his second tour in Vietnam and his R&R in Thailand, he came home and he told his wife, he was married, Anne, and they had 3 children. He told Anne that he met Tita on the plane. In fact, they were traveling together. And he told Anne, he said, "I'm going to try and get her a job," which of course he did, as his wife. And you know, so but by the end, by the time I knew them, she was pretending to still be living there, but she wasn't. And it was very complicated. He was an incredibly sentimental man. I found, of course, what happened to Phong just through complete accident. He had died in a re-education camp. He'd been starved to death when he died when Tiger Woods was 8 months old, and his widow was living in Tacoma, Washington. I went up and knocked on the door, and she had 2 of her 9 children with her, and so the 2 children and the widow, I took them to Cyprus to see Earl, and Tiger flew in from Orlando. And I don't really think Tiger cared much about this, but he pretended to because, you know, he loved his father. And I said to him, I said, he said to me in the living room, he said, he said, always knew there was another Tiger. I didn't know him as Tiger Phong. I knew him as Tiger One. He said, and I said, well, did he matter to you? You know, I had the feeling that it didn't. And he said, more than I can explain to you. He said, everything I hear, I'm just like him. And he said, he saved my father's life, or I wouldn't be here. He said, that's my connection to him. But I have to admit, to my surprise, I thought he'd be dutifully polite to these people, these Vietnamese. But he was incredibly sweet to them. Mm. You know, he was very, very sweet to them. And Tiger and I were kind of stuck with each other all day. You know, like Earl's weeping and stuff involved with these people. You know, and he's offering them cars, and, you know. But yeah, Tiger and I sat on his bed in his old little boy room. He had all his Star Wars paraphernalia there. You know, the closet was papered with Obi-Wan Kenobi. There was a football card on the wall. A guy named Joyner, who played for the Chargers, who I knew. He played for the Bengals when I was a boy columnist in Cincinnati. And Charlie Joyner, he's in the Hall of Fame. And Tiger and I had a long conversation about that. And then he told me about being on That's Impossible and sitting in Fran Tarkenton's lap. He's a Minnesota Viking quarterback. And, you know, he was really a human being then, but he as time went on, he started, you know, he pulled into himself and stopped giving of himself to writers.
Do you think that's understandable or excusable, or should he have given more of himself?
I don't blame him. Everybody goes their own way. Palmer said that to me. I said to Palmer, I was sitting in his office at Bay Hill, and I told him I wanted just a quick thing on Tiger, and he said, let me think about this for 2 seconds. I want to make sure I say what I want to say. And so he turned and he looked out the window for maybe a minute.
Right.
And then he said to me, he said, I've made my life sharing my life with the public. I've shared my life with the public. He says, I think that's the happier way to go. But everybody has to go his own way. And he said, you know, Tiger doesn't want to share his life with anyone, you know, and he said, I'm not going to question him. You know, I'm not going to say that he should do what I do. I'm just going to tell him that I think he'd be happier if he did. Yeah. You know, and to me, Arnold said in a sentence, he kind of got it better than anybody else. Earl had died by this time. I think Earl died in 66.
06.
Oh, excuse me, 06. Yeah. And Earl, Arnie said to me, he said, I think when Tiger lost his father, he lost himself. And to me, you can't say it any quicker than that. You know, I think it's true. I think that's when Tiger went off the deep end, and I didn't think he'd come back. To be honest with you, after enough time went by, and he you know, it had been so many years, and I didn't expect him to make it back. And then he finally, when he did kind of make it back, he came back further than I ever imagined he would. He won the Tour Championship, and I just didn't. Of course, he wasn't Tiger Woods, but he was one of the good players. He was like back on the page at the biggest events, but he wasn't dominant, and he was never going to be dominant again.
Does that surprise you that he was happy to be just one of those guys after what he was before? It does me slightly. I mean, especially now that he's won the Masters. I mean, and there are signs, I don't know if you'll agree with this, but there are signs, I think, that he's just about had enough. He's not the player he was.
No, well, he wasn't the player. He won the Masters shooting 70.
Yeah.
And come from behind. Basically, all those guys who hit the ball in the water at 12 lost the Masters. And he was still there. So he won the Masters. But
plus, Tom, the way golf is now at the top level, he's not one of the longest players anymore. I mean, I watched him closely at the President's Cup at Royal Melbourne last year on a golf course that was designed to be played by somebody like him, and it was an education to watch. But that works to a certain extent at Augusta. I mean, he's probably just about long. Obviously, he won last year, but he's still long enough to play on a course that involves strategy and thought and a bit of shot making and all the rest of it. But week to week on the PGA Tour, that isn't going to win very often, if at all.
No. Well, on Tuesday, before that Masters last year, someone in the press tent asked him, do you really have to win here again? Or do you just want to win here again?
Yeah.
And he said, I don't really have to win here again, but I really want to. And of course he did. And I was kind of glad he did.
Yeah. It's a great story.
But I had bet 20 quid on him through you, I'm pretty sure, at William Hill.
Yeah.
I bet him to win at Carnoustie, and which he didn't. And but he played with the winner the last day, and he shot 71 to Molinari's 69, and he finished tied for sixth. And my reasoning was 3 has-beens in a row had won the Open Championship. Darren Clarke, Ernie Els, Phil Mickelson. And so I bet on him, but not because I thought he was the best player in the world. I don't think he's the best player in the world. But he, he could have won it. He could have won at Carnoustie. Or as I say, well meant, as we losers say.
Yes.
But he, I mean, the Masters didn't change anything or prove anything last year. It was nice, big moment, but it was kind of an accident, and it, I've heard people say it was his finest moment and it was his greatest victory. Baloney. His finest moment, his greatest victory was at Pebble Beach in 2000.
Yeah. That might be the best golf that's ever been played, I think.
I just don't think anybody's just ever going to touch that. And I've seen him do wonderful things. And I consider the Open Championship he won in Liverpool as one of his highlights.
Yeah.
Just because of how he did it. He put away the driver, and he trusted himself to hit better 4-irons than Ernie could hit wedges.
Yeah.
And when he and Ernie were tied, they weren't tied. I think Tiger was 1 up, but they were in the last twosome on Saturday, and they went out and they both kind of played horribly. Ernie short gamed a 78 into a 71, and Tiger, his only bad putting day, he putted a 66 into a 71. And so they both shot 71. But on the way out, Tiger's on that practice putting green right in front of the clubhouse there. Yeah. And he's hitting those one-handed with his right hand putts. And he looks over at Hank Haney, who was staying at the Golf Digest house. And I'm standing next to Hank. And as you know, I'm fairly large. But Tiger didn't see me, and he looked over at Hank and he said, maybe if I break this big guy's heart one more time, he'll go away and stay away.
Yeah.
And then he saw me and his heart dropped. You can see it. His heart dropped.
Yeah.
And I said, man, I'm letting you off the hook this time. I said, I'm letting you off the hook this time only because you're starting out. If you were coming in and said that, I'd write it.
Yeah.
But I don't want you thinking about that on the first tee. Forget it. Skip it. It's over. I'm not going to, And the opposite side of that coin was I was once standing on a tee with him and Butch Harmon and a couple of other people. And in those days, before the FedEx Cup, Mickelson used to take the end of the year off because he didn't want to play at the end of the year anyway.
Yeah.
He didn't need the money. And his wife was pregnant again, and she had tough pregnancies. And so he was staying home with her, And so Butch Harmon says, "Where's Mickelson been?" And Tiger said, "Breastfeeding."
Oh, dear.
He saw me. I said, "Sorry, pal."
Yeah.
I wrote that. Yeah. I wrote that in a bunch of notes. And one of the notes was Fred Couples had just broken up with his wife, that gaudy woman who died young and sad. She was a polo pony.
Yeah.
She had polo pony. And so in a notes column in which I included breastfeeding, I put in there the reason going around, in the horrible divorces, it's always the polo ponies who suffer the most.
So it turns out that Tom Callahan is not just a great writer of stories, he has a knack for telling them too. Hopefully you're enjoying his tales so far, and there is more to come in just a moment. But I wanted to take this opportunity to remind you that there's an entire back catalogue of The Thing About Golf if you haven't already discovered it. There's been some terrific interviews in there, right from our very first guest, Sue Worcester, through Barnbougle Dunes owner Richard Sattler, and even the great Kari Webb. To check it out, head to the Golf Australia website at golfaustralia.com.au and click the podcast tab, or do what all the smart and cool people are doing and subscribe. Now, subscription's a bad word for it because it's actually free. But what it means is you don't have to do a thing. New episodes are automatically delivered to your device as soon as they're released. You can subscribe at lots of different places. If you have an Apple device, there's a built-in app called Podcasts. If you're on Android, try Google Podcasts, or if you're already a Spotify user, you can find us in their podcast section as well. Also, don't forget to check out the magazine page on Facebook, Golf Australia, and you can also find Thing Golf on Twitter at THING, capital GOLF. That's enough of the admin. Let's get back to John Huggan and Tom Callahan.
Yeah, I want to move you along a bit, Tom. I mean, you've been to the biggest sporting events in the world. The heavyweight boxing matches, the Super Bowls, the World Series, all that stuff. Where do the top golf, the majors, rank in amidst all that? Where would you put them?
Up high. When Tiger won the Masters to have all four cups on his mantle at the same time, I consider that one of the best things I ever covered. And I near the end of the times I was around sports, I valued the odd things, the odd stories. That you were going someplace, Sarajevo. You were going someplace that you were never going to go again. And those things mattered. I mean, there's no intrinsic value to Bobby Riggs, Billie Jean King, but I counted that as a big event at the Astrodome just because it was so unique. It was so unusual. I covered an America's Cup in Australia where I sailed the Indian Ocean with Dennis Conner. Yeah. What part of the advantage of being a Time magazine writer, and he was going to be on the cover of Time. I was writing. one of his self-important yes men. When I was arrived, they introduced me to him, and he said, "Yeah, we're on your cover next week." I said, "That's probably the reason I'm here." But I sailed with him. His men raised a spinnaker they called Dolly Parton. It had all these pouches in the wind, and Dennis said, Look at her shake those thingies. You know? You're never going to see anything like this again. You know, and so I liked all those odd things. The big fights, it's like in Zaire, 4:00 in the morning in Africa. That's pretty dramatic. You know, it's dramatic. And of course, you're talking about my weakness for Ernie Els. Of all the athletes I encountered, the one I had the biggest weakness for was Ali.
Yeah.
Ali, he never greeted me differently. He always said the same thing to me every time he saw me. How's Angie? I like her better than you. And he never met her, my wife.
Yeah.
But I handed her the phone once when I was trying to get rid of him. And I went into the next column, came out, and she was still talking to him an hour and a half later. And, you know, his fights, the big fights, they always got in my stomach. I could sit at a Super Bowl and read a newspaper, you know, but the big fight, and there weren't too many of them, but, you know, Leonard Duran in Montreal, you know, where Jack Nicklaus and Tom Watson were sitting at ringside.
Really? Wow.
The Canadian Open was going on, and they had good seats. They were sitting right in the first row after the writers. The biggest golf tournaments that I covered, certainly that Pebble Beach one, you know, and I guess even St. Andrews that year, you know, but the biggest tournaments mattered, you know, they got. And
what about the Ryder Cup, Tom? What do you make of that? Is it overblown? Do we make too much of it, or is it just too much fun to do that?
No, I think it's great, but it's the funny thing is I covered very few of them because when I was a columnist, newspaper columnist, there was always a better story going on at the same time. You know, there were playoffs and world championships going on in America, you know. And so, I mean, I went to a few of them. I went to Spain, and I went to Louisville. I went to a few of them. I bet I went to 4 or 5 of them, but nothing like it was much bigger later. I mean, when they were playing at the Greenbrier and things like that, it wasn't a front page story in America. Well, and you know, Tom Weisskopf was deciding to go hunting instead of going to the Ryder Cup. You know, I mean, the players. It wasn't as one-sided as people seem to remember because the matches were all good.
Yeah,
but the result was one-sided, and so it wasn't high on my list. You know, I'm sorry to say, I don't know how. As you I'm sure know, I had a great weakness for Seve Ballesteros, and I don't even know why, because I wasn't at too many Ryder Cups, and I never really knew him. I talked to him a few times in crowds. I only had one brief conversation with him by myself, but he did something to me, and he does. He you know, and that applies to a lot of guys. I called Mickelson once to talk about Arnold Palmer on the phone. He called me back and he said, "Before we talk on Arnold, can we talk on Seve for a minute?" He wanted to talk to somebody who knew, you know, somebody who understood.
Yeah.
Because Seve mattered to him. And he told me how one of their sponsors was Boss. And so they would see each other at certain events and they teased each other. And, you know, he just was so full of joy talking about it that it helped me kind of understand why I had this feeling for him.
Yeah. Well, to me, I mean, Seve was my all-time favourite, as you probably know. And, I mean, simply because Seve played golf the way that everybody would want to play golf. He wasn't the best player, and he certainly wasn't the straightest player, and he wasn't a lot of things. But that's the way that, if you had a choice, that's the way you would want to play, the way he played.
Yeah, I know what you mean. There was just something about him. Of course, I was at the first Masters he won, And in those days, and he ran away with that Masters, and he was Tyrone Power Hansen. He was as good looking a golfer as anyone ever saw, and I can remember rounds following him. I remember following him with Mickelson once. I can remember following him and Tom Watson. That second Masters that Seve won. But my biggest memory of him is the day before the '97 Masters. When Tiger was 21 and won by 12 shots.
Yeah.
And on that Wednesday, which was Seve's 40th birthday, Tiger played with Jose Maria Olazabal and Seve for 9 holes, front 9. And at the end of each hole, they would stick a peg in the green, and they would have a contest, 100-footers, up, down, and around. The longest, most undulating putt they could find on the green. And they were like schoolboys, enjoying it. And after 9 holes, Tiger went off by himself. Him and Mike Callahan, Fluff Callahan. And Seve walked by me, and I said to him, "Does 40 feel any different?" And he said, "How you know I shoot 40?" I said, and he came over and he put his arms around me and he said, "Mi amigo." And later that afternoon, Tiger's hitting golf balls, and I'm looking at his bag to see what he's hitting. And he says, "It's an 8-iron." He says, I usually start with 8-irons. He said, "I probably hit more 8-irons than any other club." I said, "Except putter." He said, "Yeah, except putter." So I said, I was curious, why did you leave Ollie and Seve? And he said, "I wanted to go off by myself and try some things I'd seen Seve do." He said, there are some things you can only learn from another player. He said, if could have gone out by myself without Mike, I would have. And I thought to myself, that's how great Seve is.
Yeah,
that's how great.
Yeah, Seve could hit shots that nobody else could hit. Literally nobody else could hit.
And in those days, Tiger wasn't afraid to tell you. Today, he wouldn't tell you.
Yeah.
But he told me, he said, you can only learn. There's some things you can only learn from another player.
Yeah.
And
but Seve suffered in, maybe not quite as much, but from the equipment changes that have come along. I mean, when they started, everybody was using 60-degree wedges. It meant that a lot of guys could hit the shots that only Seve could hit before. The bit more loft gave them advantage. And Tiger suffered unbelievably, I think. I mean, for all that Tiger won, which is extraordinary, obviously, I think he would have won half as much again if the equipment hadn't advantaged or brought the average guy closer to him than he was entitled to be, really.
That's interesting. I can remember a shot Seve hit on the 4th hole at Augusta, the long par 3. He was playing with Raymond Floyd, and he missed the green to the right. And I don't know what club he used, but he hit it straight up in the air. I'm going to say 100 feet in the air. And he hit it. He swung as hard as if he was hitting a driver. Went straight up in the air, came down, hit about a 10-footer, made it. And so later in the press room, Floyd's in first, giving his birdies and bogeys. And somebody said, "Could you describe the shot hit that Seve hit on the 4th hole?" And Floyd said, "Yes, but it's going to take me a few minutes." And he said, "Describe it." He said he took a shot. He did a shot I wouldn't do in a million years. I wouldn't attempt in a million years.
And Floyd was no mean short game expert, by the way.
No, yeah. But he said I'd have tried to hit something on the back of that green, hoping for a 25-footer. He said. So anyway, he said he hit a 12-footer and made it. And then Sevy comes in, and he's giving his birdies and bogeys. You know how they rattle them off.
Yeah. Driver,
6-iron, 2 putts. You know, driver, 3-wood in the front bunker, splashed out, missed it. You know, 3-wood, bad 5-iron, 2 putts. You know, he gets the 4th hole and he says, missed the green, pitched it, made it. Driver on the 5th hole. And somebody stopped and said, would you mind going over that 4th again? And was that a pretty good shot? And Sevy goes, yeah, very good shot, pretty good shot. I hit a wedge, opened it up as far as I could, hit it as high as I could, hit about a 6-footer, made it. And so I said to him, Rick Floyd was in there a few minutes ago. He called it a 12-footer, then a 10-footer. You called it an 8-footer, now it's a 6-footer. Is there any chance that ball's still moving? And the funny thing is, he got mad.
Really? Wow.
Okay. You say 6-foot, 10-foot, better for me. You know, okay. But yeah, I mean, he hit great shots that never even crossed his mind. They were great shots. Jack Nicklaus says the greatest shot he ever saw was a wood out of a bunker in a Ryder Cup.
Yeah, 83 at Palm Beach PGA National playing against Fuzzy Zeller. I went to Zeller once at a Masters and asked him about that shot that Sevy hit, and Zeller said he was standing in the middle of the fairway, 25 yards away or whatever, and when Sevy hit it, he says, I stood there and applauded. I mean, how good is that? I mean, that doesn't happen every day where the guy, it's on the last hole of the match as well.
Yeah.
He actually applauded the shot that Sevy hit.
Well, if Jack Nicklaus says that's the best shot he ever saw, that's something.
Yeah.
But I doubt Sevy ever mentioned that shot.
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, you had to ask him about those things, as you say. He wasn't, because it didn't actually mean that much to him, but because he did it every day, pretty much.
Yeah,
and even at the end, Tom, when he was basically hopeless. I mean, he couldn't play at all, long game wise. He was still worth watching. I used to go out and watch him when it was horrific to watch, but he would still hit a couple of shots that you would just go, wow. Nobody else could do that. It was all within 100 yards, but because he couldn't play at all beyond that, but it was still worth watching him.
Yeah. Well, I for several reasons, mostly things I saw than interaction with him. The first 3 years Ernie Els played in the match play at Wentworth, he won all 3 tournaments, and these are 36-hole matches, and he walked through that tournament 3 straight years.
Yeah.
And the best match in those early matches, he beat Sevy on the 34th hole on a day when they had 13 twos between them.
Yeah.
13 twos. And Sevy and Arnie chipped in on each other twice, on top of each other. And I went into the locker room, and Ernie's not there, but Sevy's there sitting with Niels, Ernie's father, who was a tough guy. He had a trucking company in South Africa. He was a tough guy, Niels, and he's weeping. He's sitting there with Sevy and he's crying. And Sevy's telling him, whispering to him, how good your boy is and how good he's going to be. And I thought, he's just lost this killer match. It's so generous. I mean, Sevy had a generosity of spirit. And again, he wasn't the perfect person either.
No, far from it, yeah.
But he had this generosity of spirit. And I told Ernie that. Ernie teared up. I was telling him, I said, he was there talking to your dad, and your dad was crying. And T. Niels was not a crier.
No.
And I said he was telling him how good you were and how good you're going to be.
Yeah, but Seve would be Ernie's idol growing up as well. I mean, he was everybody's idol.
I'm sure.
Outside America. And I've heard you say this before, but it's and I agree completely. It's one of the great tragedies of golf of the last 50 years or whatever that Seve in America didn't get along better.
I blame the American writers. They took the easy, lazy way out. They're always writing about the Matador and the Cape, and they didn't let the people know him. And he could have been our Seve too. But the American writers decided he was their Palmer. He's their Palmer. That was shorthand for who he was, what he did. And it cheated Americans out of knowing him. And of course, when he arrived at the PGA Tour, there were a lot of rednecks, like the Hill brothers, who didn't want a great player from Europe to come over and take their prize money.
Yeah.
Who, were cruel to him. Not just him, cruel to Jack Newton. Cruel.
Tony Jacklin was the first one who suffered that, really. And Bobby Locke, even way back in the 50s, was basically run out of town, because he was too good for them.
Yeah, and the commissioner didn't do it.
No,
golf. He didn't do golf any favors either. And I know there are problems with Seve, and I know he wanted appearance money in Europe, etc. He had all these, he wasn't perfect, but a big opportunity was missed, in my view, that he could have been America's Seve too, and especially after he lost his game, he'd walk by and people would just weep. Were so touched by him, and the reason they were touched by him was he tried so hard. He wanted to win so badly, that you couldn't help but be touched by him. And when I've said to people, of all the golfers I've ever been around, the most compelling was Seve Ballesteros, and they look at me blankly like, huh?
Yeah. But that just goes back to the earlier point. They didn't get it, and it's a shame.
Oh, the 86 Masters, and you say Seve? Yeah, I do. I say Seve. And people don't understand. They don't get it, which is a real sad thing, because they should get it. They should have been able to see him. And I saw that movie on him where at the end it's Jose Maria and him standing there.
Oh my God, yeah, that I've seen that movie as well, and that's the only part that I hadn't seen before, or wasn't part of the story I wasn't familiar with. That was at the end of a BBC Sports Personality of the Year Awards show, where Seve got the overseas, personality part of it. And we saw Ollie giving Seve the trophy and all the rest of it, but the bit that was in the movie that you're referencing, that came afterwards, and nobody saw that until it was shown in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But it made me cry. I know that.
What a killer! What a killer! But yeah, he was amazing. And I've talked to players. Most of the players got it, even in America.
Mm-hmm.
That's the players. The players got it, but the writers didn't get it, and which is really sad. And
but things have moved on a bit. You look at the way that, admittedly, Rory lives in America and he's married to an American, but he's been accepted far more, and he's the guy that everybody says everybody plays their best. Rory wins, and whether that's still true or not is up for debate, but he's certainly right up there. I mean, and he's hugely charismatic, but he seems to be far more accepted than the previous generations were, if you like.
The only honorary American of my time was Greg Norman.
Yeah.
And that was because Frank Shirkini of CBS needed a hero. And he said, I'm going to make this guy my hero. And of course he was great too. And so Americans kind of embraced him as their own, and which was very unusual. But
what do you make of Rory these days?
Well, I've always liked him. I spent some time in Belfast doing a project, and I lived in a little town where he lived in, Hollywood. Of course, I didn't know him when he was a child, but I was there in '95. But that day I was with him at Sawgrass. I was like baffling him because I'm telling him all these things. He can't understand how I know this. I'll say, is Bertie still the fish and chips guy in Hollywood?
Yeah.
How do you know this? I was driving him crazy. And but anyway, I told him, I said, yeah, I played that jerkwater course of yours, Hollywood Country Club. I said, I would have kicked your ass so bad there. And I said to him, of course, this is 1995, and you were 4 years old. And he said, are you sure? He said, I was pretty good when I was 4. Which is, he could have beat me when he was 4 at Hollywood. But
he certainly could have beat you at putting. I know that.
Yes, that's true. But I just think he had the right stuff. He seemed, the mistakes he made were the mistakes of a kid, and we're not evil, and we're not, angry. And he was, when he was great, he was wonderful. And I like the way he kind of stood up to Koepka. Koepka's got a big talent, but he could use a punch in the nose.
Yeah.
And Rory, when Koepka is saying things against another player, he steps up for the other player out loud, and in the press room. And I think he senses, or maybe just flat knows, how important his part in golf is now. And so he takes responsibility, and I'm going to be very disappointed if this lack of the Masters goes on and on to the point where it's debilitating.
Yeah.
Once he's won the 4, he'll win 3 more in 5 years. He's so good, and I used to say Norman was the best longest driver, straightest longest driver I ever saw. Even more than Jack, and Jack was a straight long driver. I mean, Jack could do a lot of things. People don't remember, how good he was, but that's the way it's always going to be. People will forget, how good they all are.
Yeah, Tom, I'm conscious of the fact that we've gone on now for an hour and 26 minutes and a bit, but I'm going to ask you to finish this thing off by telling your favourite Muhammad Ali story. Nothing to do with golf, but your Muhammad Ali stories are too good to miss. So give me your best one.
Oh God, do you have one particular one in mind?
The Zaire, the aftermath of Zaire, when your prediction on how he was going to do in that fight.
Yeah, of course. I thought we were there for his valedictory, and I couldn't have been more wrong. But they had a betting sheet on the wall in Zaire, in Selly, where the writers were staying, a hacienda. And I picked Foreman and won. I couldn't get out of my head what Foreman had done to Ken Norton, and he was knocking guys out of the ring.
Yeah, Joe Frazier. I mean, he destroyed him as well, didn't he? Yeah.
He ran for the first time in his life, and he got knocked down 6 times. And Frazier was a sweet guy too. Frazier used to wrap his own hands, and he was in Philadelphia, and he'd say, "Tom, put your finger right there, please." And I'd put my finger on the tape, and then he'd finish wrapping his hands.
Yeah.
But he was. Once Frazier said to me, or I said, I guess I said to him, I said, I said, "Joe, once won, is a championship ever completely lost?" And Frazier said, "A champion would be a champion if he's a champion." Do you know who said that? I said, "Who?" "God," he said. So we're in Africa now, and Ali, he comes into the writer's room, and he's looking on the wall at all the bets, and he comes to Foreman and 1, and he turns around and he waves to me to come outside with him. So we went out into the dark, blacker than midnight, and we held on to each other because it was so dark you couldn't see your feet, and we made our way down to the bank of the Congo River, and we got there, and he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I don't want you ever to forget it. Black men scare white men more than black men scare black men." That was the whole fight. We were petrified of George Foreman. And so now the fight starts, or the anthem starts, 4 o'clock in the morning at the stadium, 100,000 black faces. And Angelo Dundee, Ali's trainer, he's stuck in Foreman's corner checking on the gloves or something, and he's afraid to move while the anthem's going. So Ali's alone in his corner, and he's looking across at Angelo, and he goes, "Angelo, Angelo." Angelo's not moving. Then he finally says, "Angelo, look at him. He's huge. Look at the arm of Angelo. He's huge." And I thought to myself, uh-oh. And so now the first round was basically a no-hitter. Ali used the first round to prove to himself that Foreman couldn't hit him in the head, which no one could. And the bell rang at the end of the round, which eliminated me from the pool. And Ali ran to the corner, spit out his mouthpiece, and straight over my head, he shouted to Herbert Muhammad, his manager, Elijah Muhammad's son, "Leave him to me." And I turned to Vic Siegel of the New York Daily News, and I said, "Wrong again, Vic."
Yeah.
I knew that I was wrong. And Foreman fell in the 8th round, not from one punch, but from 1,000 jabs, dead in the face. He was blushing. First time I ever saw a black man with a red face. Yeah. And Ali, years later, he's getting ready to fight Larry Holmes in Las Vegas. And the two of us are alone in his hotel room, and he says to me, "Who you picking?" I said, "The other guy, champ." He said, "You always wrong." I hope so.
Yeah. Anyway, Tom, you've been right far more than you've ever been wrong in my mind, and thank you for your time. You've been very generous as ever. It's over an hour and a half of yabbering to me. I think you deserve a medal for that anyway, and thanks again for your time.
Well, good luck with this new thing, John.
What a life Tom Callahan has had, and what a terrific way to finish the 2020 season of The Thing About Golf. Yes, that was our last for the year, but we will be back before you know it with episode 33. Keep an eye out for us on Twitter and Facebook and in your podcast apps, and we'll look forward to your company on the other side of the new year.